Cool. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Welcome. So effectively, what we'll be looking at today is a live build Lite, so a very brief representation of what Flow Gear looks like, the console, the design, and our design approach, and what some of the tools look like. Now, if it's not very obvious to you guys, we are tech people, so please don't expect the same level of smoothness that you found there. That being said, we're happy to be that way, otherwise we're going to be poached by the sales team, so we'll keep it as awkward as possible if we can avoid that. So that being said, a couple of things again with our design approach is, in terms of what we provide with Flow Gear, is visualization. So Dan spoke about that briefly. It comes down to what you can see on your canvas and how you build against that. There's also abstraction of complexity. So these tools are built to take away some of the things you just don't have to see, such as authentication, what it looks like. Exposing samples, it's not going to make a lot of sense now, but it effectively is how you pick the action you'd like to perform against that particular product, and you'll see exactly what that looks like. And then finally, our simplified tooling for complex efforts. So the quick map, a fantastic example. It's mapping the data from point to point visually. It is a one-for-one great scenario in terms of what is used for visualization as a tool. That being said, we'll be splitting this into two sections. One is exploring the console. The other one is exploring the canvas. Within the console, there's a couple of things that I'm going to touch on very, very high level here, and then we'll leave it to Carl to take it in more depth. But workflows being the first one. This is where we obviously design these solutions, test them, and deploy them. Connections are a unique place to plug in credentials for a particular platform or product, and we can talk on how that's stored and what that looks like. Workflow logs is where you're going to discover what's actually been happening in a transactional state on your platform. Drop points, for those who are working with systems like Syspro or anything else that's on-prem, it's going to allow you to actually install a lightweight agent on-prem, which allows you to then communicate with the primary Flow Gear environment. So you do not have to have Flow Gear installed on-prem to communicate with those services. And then settings, obviously, is just general management for your platform, where you can restart your VM if you have to, or even upload nodes and similar things. What is the design canvas? So effectively, it's the space in which the stuff is built, as I mentioned, and nodes are effectively elements that are dropped onto the design canvas that will then describe a particular integration process. So those are two things you can just remember for now. We will go through the categories of those nodes, so it will be effectively where their place is in the platform, and we'll do connectors, triggers, processes, and flow controls. I'll leave that up to Carl to actually go through. I think that's about that for this, so we'll hand over back to Carl.
100%.
Cool, go for it.
We've got the right tab.
Yes.
As Nick mentioned, this might be very awkward, so I do apologize in advance. Our bosses told us we were doing this the other day, so it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. All right. So what we're looking at here is the Flow Gear console. So when you log in, this is what you find. As Nick mentioned, the workflows, that's where your entire integration lives through its entire life cycle. So test, UAT, all the way through to production. You don't have to go dig through 1,000 folders and for other people's machines, then your IT guy left and you can't find the thing that you need because he had the documentation. It's all here. We kind of solved for that. It's what happens when your application is built by IT guys. We understand the pain. We are going to dig into that in a little bit more detail in a bit. So there's a few other sections I just want to point out to you. We have our connections.
Eventually.
Eventually, yeah. The little squirrel's losing his mind, loading the internet. There we go.
I think if you guys can just hop off the Wi-Fi for while we're busy, then it'd be fantastic.
100%. Stop those torrents, please, people. So the connections, I know that sometimes there's a little bit of confusion between connections and nodes, but we're connecting to the thing, but that's a node, but not a connection. So the connections, this is your credentials. So your passwords, your API keys, those types of things. And the nice thing is you have one secure environment to store them, and you can use them in multiple integrations as many times as you like. Now, the advantage is you update them in one place, it propagates through all your integrations. So you don't get to month end and realize you've been publishing all your invoicing into the test database. Quite handy. I'm not speaking from experience, I promise, to be very professional. Next up, we have our drop points. Now, the drop points enable Flow Gear to access any on-prem system. So this could be within a data center or an on-prem system. It could even be a laptop. So if you need to get some files up off your laptop into integration, it's also 100% acceptable. It's essentially, it's a lightweight software agent that'll create a persistent outbound connection into Flow Gear's cloud. Now, the nice thing is everyone always stresses about security at this stage. All the data passing through is encrypted and compressed and allows you to access Flow Gear without poking any holes in your firewall. So in terms of implementation, we don't have that 400 email string between you and your networking team going, why won't it work? Again, we've all been there. And then lastly, we have our settings. So this is where you can go in and check all your settings for your environment, make sure things are up and running. You can access user permissions. You can access your platform logs at the root level. And I know Nick generally has one or two things to say. Yes, I'm just
Yeah, so effectively, this is the one space for access for whoever's going to be involved in Flowgear in some capacity. So there's role-based access for a reason. You'll have different people doing different things in the space, whether you're designing these solutions and deploying them, or whether you're simply coming to the stage to go and check reporting or logging or whatever the case might be. So it is that one area for all of that.
Absolutely. All right, so let's go back to the workflows. I'm just going to create a new one here at the top. We're going to keep the generic name, Pink Unicorn, fabulous. Save that. All right. And when that saves, there we go. Thanks for hopping off the Wi-Fi, we appreciate it. Okay, so this is the design canvas. This is where we expose all of our tooling, as Nick mentioned, by the use of nodes, or the nodes are the tooling we expose. There we go. He does have a very fabulous explanation for what a node is, and I always get tongue-tied, so if you wouldn't mind repeating it again.
So the nodes are elements that are dropped onto the design canvas, which will then describe a particular integration process. And depending on that description, you're going to see the 4 categories they're going to fit into in a second.
I'll run through those. I always get stuck on that one. Okay. All right, so to access the nodes, you'll see there's this little plus sign that chases your cursor around. If we click on that, you get given this screen, and you'll see there that we've got 264 odd nodes. Now, for those of you that haven't worked with the platform before, everyone always wonders if it's ring-fenced. Do we only get to certain things? Is it a trial? Once you sign in, or sign up rather, you get access to everything. So sky's the limit. As long as you have that Sage or SQL implementation, that's yours, we have the node for it. Go nuts. So within the nodes, we've got 4 categories. So we have our connectors. These are generally the meat and bones of your integration. Essentially, the connectors wrap a third-party API service, and we generally have 100% coverage of the underlying API. Now, I'm sure all of us have dealt with IT documentation at some stage, and it's never great. Let's be honest. We like building things, we don't like writing about them. So essentially, this simplifies that process. We'll give you a sample of the interaction that is available for that API, as well as sample payloads and things like that, but Nick will be using those today, so it'll make a little bit more sense when he actually shows you what they look like. Next, we have our triggers. So what's actually going to fire off your integration or your workflow and things like that. So we can do day schedulers. We can sit and watch a SQL table for an update. We can fire it off that way. We can even watch an inbox for an email to come in from a jilted ex-lover and then route them into spam. Not the ideal implementation, but it's there. We're not going to tell you how to build your things. Next, we have our processes. So I hope you all remember Anthony's description of the data wizard. That's this section, namely the quick map. So the processes are nodes that will typically act on data in memory. And as mentioned, that will include things like the quick map, because 2 systems never speak to each other. If they did, things would be a bit awkward at home because we'd have to
find a good job.
Yeah. And as we've noticed, we're not good with people. All right, and then lastly, we have our flow control nodes. So the flow control nodes will perform evaluations that will allow you to do conditional branching within your workflow. So if you have a bunch of data coming in, you're missing some key fields, we can then route that into a separate section, update some logging, fire off alert emails, or just feedback to the client and saying, listen, there's something wrong here, please fix, and so on. All right, that's everything from me. I'm going to give it back to Nick, and he will show you some more stuff.
Fantastic. So as you'd imagine, it's a collection of these 4 categories that are going to solve some kind of integration or automation challenge. You would need all of these to get some kind of production-ready solution. Now, there are some very, very key ones that we're going to work with that are going to describe the core of an integration, which is effectively your extract, your transform, and your load portion. So just before we get to that, a little bit of a sort of background. The use case we'll be building out now in a very lightweight manner is our Shopify to Dynamics 365 sales. We'll be pulling sales orders out of Shopify and into 365 sales. What it's supposed to represent for you guys is a typical scenario where you have a front end for e-commerce, you're getting those sales created, or those orders created by customers, and you have to put it into your CRM or your ERP. Now, you can imagine just about any different platforms or products on either side of this process, but this is what we'll use for that particular demo. So that being said, you start this off by picking the appropriate nodes and placing them onto the canvas, and so we'll do so by using, first of all, Shopify as the source for data. We'll then go ahead and grab QuickMap, which was mentioned to be the flagship tool for transformation.
Or the data wizard.
Data wizard, there we go. I like that one better. And then we're going to go ahead and grab 365 sales as the target. And the expectation is now the data has to move from point to point between these systems, right? Now, the next step will be to set up the connection for these systems. That being said, we've predefined these connections, obviously, in the interest of time. But what we'll do is we'll pick them by clicking on the drop-down, and we'll actually go and show you what that looks like. So if you were doing this for the first time, you'd have to go and actually create a new connection, edit that connection, and fill in a set of credentials. Now, I mentioned previously that the credentials will be unique to the platform or product that you're actually looking to integrate with. So we'll guide you. When you get to this page, we'll tell you exactly what we need from you. Now, in this case, we need a URL, a client ID, and a client secret. So I'm not going to get into too much detail. For those of you familiar with app registrations in Azure, this is how we would get these credentials in the first place. Now, we've got that. What we can do at this point is we can fill them in, and we can actually go ahead and click on this test connection button, which is expected to actually go and authenticate. And typically, we run some kind of operation against this to determine if this is in fact now successfully working. And so if you see the green banner, fantastic. You've got a connection into that system. Now you can head back to your canvas. Now, why this is important is it's going to determine where you get your data from. One thing I actually forgot to mention is that you might have seen the environments there, so test, UAT, and production. That's actually going to let you fill in credentials for the different environments you might have. And so you'll progress eventually through to the different systems as you push it to production. At that point, we're going to do the next step, which is to determine what those nodes have to do. So we have Shopify on the canvas, we have 365 sales on the canvas, but what are they actually doing for us? So as Carl mentioned, we have this concept called samples. Now, they're very important. As we head to our options and say choose sample, what's actually happening is we're generating a list of potential actions that you can perform against that particular product or environment. Now, in some cases, we have hundreds, in some cases, thousands of these samples, and they're going to mimic one for one what the documentation will be on that site for that particular product. Now, Shopify has, say, odd 300 samples, and what that allows us to do is search for what we're looking to do as the end user, such as draft orders, where we can then pick retrieving a list of draft orders. So this would effectively be how we get orders out of Shopify. And so as we click on that, two very important things are happening. Well, three technically. One is we're going to have filters that we can use, which we don't need to spend much time on there. The filters just dictate, how many records you want returned, so on and so forth. But the other two things that are very important is, number one, we've got this primed for retrieving a list of draft orders. You can see the description there. That's exactly what it's going to do for you. And then secondly, it's going to give you a sample payload of what that looks like coming out of Shopify. And this is an important part of it. This is going to be where the relationship between the two systems is going to eventually come together. And so now that we have a shape for the data, we're going to pass the response into the source for QuickMap, which makes QuickMap aware of what we're expecting to receive. At that point, we'll do exactly the same thing for 365. Sales. Specifically, we're going to see a lot more samples for this one. A few thousand, I think, actually. Just give this a second.
I think they got back on the Wi-Fi.
So we'll go ahead and look for sales order. We're going to do create sales order. So this is now the other side of what we're attempting to do, right? And exactly the same thing. We're going to prime this particular action now for the creation of the sales order. And again, we have a sample payload of what that looks like. Now, this is, for some of you, probably confusing. You have never seen these kinds of payloads before. Doesn't actually matter, right? Ultimately, what we're going to do is make the QuickMap aware of that by dragging the result into the request side now. So now the QuickMap has visibility of both those data sets. And what they look like in their main shape doesn't actually matter, because as we head to the QuickMap...
Sorry, I would interrupt him, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before we do that, naturally, if we all saw that first sample that had a bunch of string and nulls and brackets and things, that's not helpful to anyone. So nice little key feature about Flowgear, we can run our nodes in isolation.
Correct.
So what that allows us to do is run that node without it affecting anything else in the workflow. So if we're debugging or testing updates, updating scripts, that kind of thing, we can run that node, get a sample of the data back, plug it in, and then when we actually manipulate that, we know exactly what we're working with. So we have an idea of what the string looks like, how long it is, if we need to do aggregations, and things like that. Yeah,
so effectively, while the structure remains accurate for what will be coming back from Shopify, Carl is right, it's ugly to work with that sample, so we're going to go and run this in isolation from the rest of the canvas. So we're going to immediately determine two things now. Is Shopify working? And we can have a look at the activity log at the bottom here to determine that, yes, in fact, Shopify is working for us. And we can take a look at what an actual payload coming out is going to look like. This is in its tabular form, and this is in its raw form. Now, I'd much rather work with this versus what we saw previously. So we're going to go ahead and actually bring that onto the canvas. So two things we've touched on so far. First of all is abstraction of complexity. So we've basically touched on nothing in terms of the authentication of how to work in that space aside from providing credentials, and also visibility of what you can do in those environments. And now the third part is, again, as I previously mentioned, simple tooling or simplified tooling for complex efforts. So as we click on change view, we're actually given a data tree left and right-hand side. The left-hand side is Shopify, right-hand side is your 365 sales. The primary purpose of this tool now is to give you a visual element in which you can drag across mappings from point to point. So you don't have to have any intimate knowledge of a scripting language or anything like that. You can, for instance, search for an address field on both sides if you'd like to. You can sort of collapse that, and you can move across that data from point to point, and immediately you'll see a preview of what that data looks like in the expected format that Sales 365 wants it. So you can see that right here. I see these particular examples don't even have billing addresses, but that's fine. We'll fix up the full mapping just now. So again, the primary purpose of this tool is to give you a very simple mechanism by which you can do this particular effort. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually swap to a different workflow wherein we actually have the mapping completed, just for simplicity. And so we'll go through to here. And then we'll actually open up the mapping that we've completed. So we've done two things. We've actually taken out the fields that don't matter for this demo. So there's minimum mandatory fields that you need for a sales order creation. And we've mapped the stuff from point to point. And you can see what that starts to look like when you've actually come through and done that effort. Again, it's just simple mapping from left to right. But what we also understand is there's sometimes more to it than mapping the structure of the data. You may have to enrich or supplement that data in some capacity. And that comes down to the business rules that you have to adhere to in the system. So do you have field length limits for your fields on the other side? So maybe you have a address one that can only be 50 characters. Potentially you have to concatenate two fields together, whatever the case might be. What this will allow you to do is actually do exactly that with functions that are plugged into the map expressions over here on these little blocks over here. And these functions are actually very similarly modeled after Excel, again, for low barrier to entry. So it's quite simple for someone who's just got some experience in that space to come through and run some functions like this, for instance, trimming your email address from any white spaces, using a text value, using your date to add a unique prefix to your order number, potentially generating a unique value for one of these other fields, or rounding your total down to 2 characters, whatever the case might be. And so once you've got all that together, you've then got what we could see is hopefully a valid payload for 365, right? So we're going to go ahead and close this off, and we can actually now hook up the execution flows from point to point. So that's just dictating which nodes need to run after which point.
Generally, we go left to right. You can do it the other way around, but it makes things very complicated to try and read.
You're welcome to do that, of course, yes. So we'll run this from point to point. Previously, you saw one node execute on the activity log. Now you're going to see every single one of them execute after I've logged in again.
So we like to make sure you are who you say you are. Just every now and then check in. Are you okay?
So we'll give this a second to log in, and then we'll see that activity log pop up. There we go. Oh, sorry. What I didn't do here was pick the connections on this one. So helpful error there.
It emphasizes the high iteration rate.
Yeah, we're going to speak a bit more about that later on. So with our deep dive, we're going to actually touch on what the iterative process of design is. It's all about running into obstacles, fixing those obstacles, and then moving on to the next point. And this is afforded to you by the way Flowgear has been set up. But for this, very simply put, you can take a look at that output. You can see that we have got the activity log for each one of those steps. We're going to very briefly inspect them by looking at the output of the quick map, because we've already seen what came through from Shopify. And what we expect is to see a preview that is exactly the same as the one we were mapping previously, so no surprises there, right? And then we're going to take a look explicitly at the response from the 365 sales part, which has got an API response telling us that the status for all of these records was true, so it was created, and here's a unique ID for each one of those records. We could go and filter on them or find them in the system, whatever the case might be. Now, again, what this encapsulates is the extract, transform, and load portion of an integration. This is not production ready. You will have to add additional error handling and any other business logic that you like to include. But the advantage thereof is that anything else you have to include is going to be available to you through the additional tools that you see on the canvas here. So if you need to inspect that output from 365 to determine if anything failed, you will do so using, for instance, our flow control nodes as an example. And then you can kick off a different set of logic to say, okay, something failed, what do I need to do next? Do I need to alert somebody? Do I need to run a process again? Whatever the case might be, right?
Or what was actually wrong with it? We can do that as well.
Yeah, precisely. What is wrong with it? So yeah, that's the basics there. We have then got the idea of how do you actually launch these particular workflows, or how do they activate. What I've been doing here is called on demand, so I've been testing them by clicking the button. You can also have this exposed to just a front-end user who can log on and run it as well. Now this might be okay for reporting and other things that happen, maybe on a cadence that isn't set. However, we've got two other ways that we can actually kick off these workflows. The first of those is trigger-based, so effectively maybe a scheduler of sorts, and the way that we actually set that up is by going into the section for triggers and picking something like maybe, for instance, the day scheduler, right? Now, what this will allow us to do is pick a start and end time. Let's say this starts at 8 in the morning, it ends at 5 in the afternoon, and we run this every 30 minutes. This is going to dictate that this workflow is launched every 30 minutes for the whole workday, effectively. We'll hook that up by actually pushing the start node across and then through to here. And the last thing we'd actually have to do is just save this. Sorry, not save it. Set this to always on, which actually is there already. And so we'll save this. We'll head back to the landing page where, again, where I mentioned previously, we've got different roles. Someone who's maybe just the workflow launcher, if you want to call it that, or someone has to come through and run them, they can go through and turn the workflow on under a certain environment. So they won't even be able to see the design based on the role-based access that they have. They just have to turn the thing on, which is hopefully simple enough. And then the other option we have, obviously, is the ability to bring in real time to the workflows themselves. So if you preferred that Shopify could reach out to Flowgear to actually tell us, hey, there's an order waiting, can you please process this for us? We actually have the ability to do so through receiving that data directly from Shopify. And the way that we configure this is heading through to our workflow settings. Over here, you may have a domain that's relevant to your tenant, and you'll be able to actually set up something which is akin to a custom URL that you can then pass along to that particular platform like Shopify or 365 or whatever can do it, and they can then send the data through that URL, and it's going to arrive on the canvas real time so that you can obviously, it will be processed or work with it. This will be secured by API keys, and the way that it'll work is you'll head through to your API key section. I don't think we need to come back here, so that's fine. And effectively what we can do is we can create a new API key, at which point we'll choose which workflows that API key is allowed to access. So we'll do so over here. I'll just pick a random one. We'll give it an appropriate name. And then obviously once that's saved, you'll have the access that you need to actually go and provide that along with the URL to your source system like Shopify or whatever the case might be. Cool.
100%.
Fantastic.
One thing we do get asked quite a lot, because everyone has their own little system here and there, and the first question everyone asks us is, can you connect to this unique thing that I have? Because obviously you want your thing. Now, we don't necessarily have a branded connector for that. We have what we refer to as generic connectors. So whether it's web requests, SOAP, anything like that. And if any of you have worked with Postman before, they function very similar to that. So instead of us taking care of all the back-end and authentication and whatnot, where it's only a few things, you have to do a little bit more setup. So you'll need your header and your API key and things like that. But essentially, if it's exposed to the internet, we could probably connect to it.
Yeah.
There hasn't really been a system to date that I've noticed. Nick can correct me if I'm wrong here.
No, so look, our technology connectors are built as such that we can interface with basically anything out there that's generic. Obviously, it's fantastic to work with a branded connector, and we do continually expand on those connectors. So if we find a strategic value to build a connector, or we partner with somebody who wants to put a connector out there, we'll happily build that connector out. But again, those generic connectors are fantastic, and they will be able to talk to some of the smaller systems that you feel like nobody else has ever heard of. That being said, I think it was the use case over here, but we've already done that. Cool, so yeah, I mean, hopefully that gave you an idea of what Flowgear is like in terms of its design approach. We will go into more depth around the iterative process, around how you build out something that's a little more production ready. This is very basic, again, extract, transform, and load. At this point, we're happy to take any questions that anyone has around what we've shown. Maybe around some of the connectors we have available, or how we tackle certain tasks. We've got a couple there, go ahead.
Can you mock your connections, your endpoints? How do you test without, do you need an environment to test, or can you test the logic?
So you could mock it out. You could actually do that quite easily with the last section I showed you, which I didn't expand on too much, but our ability to turn a workflow into an API-bound endpoint. You could theoretically take a payload that is then provided from the Flowgear endpoint back to the system you're testing against. Obviously, what is first prize is that you test against the real environment, because you want to test authentication, you want to test what those payloads are going to look like, and validation errors, of course, as well. But yes, absolutely, you can mock things out as much as you need to. What you might have noticed is you can actually just hard code a lot of the data on the canvas itself, which means that gets returned each time, irrespective of what's happening. So you can do it that way too. Go ahead.
How complicated is the
With the data itself? Well, so the complication is pretty much limited to what you saw on the quick map. That's going to take care of 95% of your transformations. If there's a requirement to do something above that, then we're probably looking at something like a script node that we could use to maybe do something outside of that. But it very seldomly you need to go past the point where the quick map does it for you. It's got a hierarchical representation of the different payloads. You can perform transformations on it, that sort of stuff.
Thinking specific about cross mapping, where you have ENZA coming out of CDS, and you want to map that to the native language that exists in the system.
Well, so we basically take whatever the source is, whatever the target is. You can choose your target on the quick map.
So you do have multiple.
Yeah, it could be JSON and XML, XML, JSON. It doesn't matter. We'll actually infer it for you, and you can also choose it as well if you want to be what your output is.
Also, if your mapping gets very complex, you can stack quick maps on top of each other.
Exactly.
My go-to saying is, if it doesn't work, there's not enough quick maps.
Go ahead.
Partner center connection.
Again, we would explore things like that if we found value in it, or we have a partner who's looking for it. So one of our partners has built one. We just didn't have visibility of it. Okay, there we go. There's your answer. That's JJ from Global Micro, so if you want to ask about it, you can...
JJ, put up your hand. There you go, speak to that guy. He'll hook you up.
So go ahead.
How do you version control your flow?
Right, that's a great question. We were going to touch on that in some capacity on the deep dive, but I think we can speak to it very, very briefly. We've got two functions. One is effectively release management, which is the primary one in this whole thing, which what it's going to do is it's going to actually tell you where you are at with the current version of your workflow. So as I save it for the first time, it only sits within test or UAT, whatever your first environment is. You saw me pick the drop-down, right? At that point, you have to explicitly promote it to the next stage when you're ready to do so. And what's actually the backing there is, in this case, we're backed by GitHub as an example, what we're currently using. And so you can actually see where the different versions of your workflow is in, what environment it's in, and you can roll back to different versions. I'll show the UI for that in the deep dives, just to make a bit more sense. Cool. Go ahead.
Maybe for the deep dive, but do you do split and merge mapping?
Yes, absolutely. So it'll form part more of your sort of production-ready architecture. But yes, if you have to merge two particular payloads together, you can have multiple nodes execute on the extraction side of things. You can take all the data, you can move it into a single node for merge, and then you can work with it there. Or you can even reference tertiary payloads using our lookups in the quick map. So you've got two data sets. You use your lookup just to say, hey, does the stock code match what's going into the other side? So yeah, absolutely, you can do that. Cool.
Anything else? Oh. This side's very quiet.
Fantastic. All right, thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah. Oh, hang on, we missed one.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Specific type of a transaction, you want to branch into a separate workflow that handles that with its metrics already built into it.
Right, yeah. So to the first part there, the quick map has a particular function called a lookup. The lookup asks you to reference a primary key in both your primary payload and then your secondary or tertiary payloads, and then it tries to reconcile the relationship between there. So if you get a stock code that doesn't necessarily match the one on the other side, it will look in that tertiary payload to see what's the stock code supposed to be. And then on the second side of that, we will actually take a look at that in the deep dive as well, I believe. It's your second question. I think we are going to go through that particular.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so we'll touch on that, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
Awesome. I
All right,
think
thanks.
that's everyone now.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.